Chapter 1021. The memory Lewis had of Riley was when she impressed the crowd on stage back at high school. He came forward and admitted that Willow indeed had done something like that in the restaurant. However, since Willow hadn't exposed her identity in front of everyone yet, he couldn't let the situation get out of hand, so he said, "Both sides are at fault. We can gather up and find a solution afterward. There's no need to make a scene out of it." Riley looked at him and asked, "Are you blind?" "How could you?" Russell interrupted before she could finish her sentence. "Shut up, Riley. If I hear another word coming out of your mouth, I'll punish you when we get home later." Willow went forward to apologize to him, but he paid him no mind. He looked at Riley, who was exasperated. He did not know why, but he felt that she was actually a pushover, although she looked like a paper tiger. When Maisie and Nolan appeared, Riley walked up to her and complained, her mouth pouting, "Z, you're finally here. I'm so sad," as if she had found someone to back her up and that she could do whatever she wanted now. She pulled a funny face at Willow, making Lewis feel that she was such a silly and adorable girl. From then on, whenever he saw Riley, he couldn't control himself from teasing her. When she became angry, he would feel happy. It was like seeing a kitty that got pissed off but refused to stretch its claws out to hurt people. He had been reluctant to go on a blind date, but when his mother told him that she had spoken to the Hills about an engagement, he did not say no. Larissa looked at him in surprise and asked, "Didn't you say you don't like other people to make decisions for you? You refused to go on blind dates, but you said yes to an engagement?" He put the book down and lifted his head to look at his mother. "An acquaintance is better than a stranger." Of course, it was only his excuse. However, he was well aware that Riley might not like it, so he said, "Well, since we're getting engaged, I guess we have to bond first." Larissa looked at him for a while before smiling and saying, "You young people can do whatever you want. You can bond for however long you like as long as you can fall in love with each other." Initially, he intended to make her fall in love with him as soon as possible, but something happened to Maisie, and their wedding was postponed for 3 years. During those 3 years, he had approached Riley with the excuse of looking for Maisie. Riley believed him and kept avoiding him. However, the more she tried to avoid him, the more he wanted to look for her. In the end, both of them had gotten used to it. And Riley did not run away anymore when she saw him. He was infuriated when he saw her drink herself silly at the nightclub alone. He walked over, and just when he was about to ask her what she was doing, she fell into his arms. When she looked up at him drunkenly, his anger disappeared. Of course, if she had thrown up. After that, he sent her back to the Hills. He took off his jacket and asked the maid to change her clothes for her. After the maid finished changing her clothes, he walked into the bedroom and saw Riley had rolled under the bed. He shook his head helplessly and walked over to pick her up from the floor. This was the first time he saw Riley being so quiet and well-behaved. Suddenly, Riley grabbed his hand and mumbled, please stop asking." "It wasn't me." He looked at her fixedly for a long time. When he saw the drop of tear at the corner of her eyes, he couldn't help but think of the incident that had caused her to withdraw from her academy. He figured that he should investigate the matter himself. He raised his hand to wipe the tears off her cheek gently. Then, he leaned down and approached her slowly. He stopped in front of her lips and hesitated. In the end, he kissed her forehead and said, "Goodnight." Chapter 1022. However, Lewis couldn't sleep all night. After all, Riley would roll down from her bed from time to time whenever he wasn't watching her. He stayed beside her bed for the entire night until she woke up. "You're awake?" Although he was exhausted, he had to pretend that he was not. He took a look at his watch and commented, "Are you aware that you can really sleep?" "Lewis? What are you doing at my house?" Riley was stunned. Did you help me change my clothes?" Looking at the fearful expression on her face, Lewis couldn't help himself and chuckle. He decided to tease her as he said, "What's there to see with that body of yours? You jackass! Riley shouted as she threw a pillow at him. He grabbed it midair and continued. You threw up on me last night. Were you not my fiancé? I would have left you on the street. After that, he threw the pillow back at her. He did not want her to know that he had been purposely waiting for her to wake up, so he asked, Tell me, where is my cousin? Riley frowned. You went so far as to sleep on my couch all night just for this? Louis did not reply. Of course, it was not his primary goal. He was waiting for her to thank him, but it seemed to him that she was not going to do that, and he was not happy about it. She's truly a heartless one. Louis snapped himself back from his recollection and heard that Riley was laughing. Robin and Blake were saying something to her, and she was laughing happily. Blake suddenly turned his head to him and asked, Lou, how long are you going to stay in Staslo? Louis looked at Riley and replied, It depends on her. Riley, who was talking to Robin, turned her head around and met his gaze. He's waiting for me? Riley was stunned when the thought appeared in her head. She pouted her mouth and said after something popped into her head. How are we going to hold our wedding if we don't go back? Louis was stunned. Then, Riley continued. I've made a promise with Z. Robin and Blake shared a glance. Both of them could see the surprise in each other's eyes as they asked, You two haven't had a wedding yet? Riley lowered her head and said embarrassingly, Yeah. Louis chuckled and chimed in, Yeah. We have to go back to work on our wedding. After that. He looked at Robin and Blake. It seems like both of you need to come back as well. You should have told us earlier. When is your wedding? We'll book flight tickets now, Blake said as he pulled out his phone. We can't be absent from our best friend's wedding. Besides, I'm looking forward to being your best man. Louis laughed. At Bassburg, in the Blue Bay Villa. So it seems to me that our traveler is finally going to come home, Maisie chuckled when she received a call from Riley in the kitchen. I thought you're not going to come back for the rest of your life. Riley pouted and said, I'm not. I'm not going to wander in a foreign country for the rest of my life. Maisie turned the fire down and continued with a laugh. You're right. Barbara and I have talked about this before. If you don't come back, we'll hold the wedding first. You can take all the time you want. At that time, we'll remove you from our chat group. Hey! How can you do that to me? I've only been away for a month or so, and you treat me like this. Riley complained. Maisie chuckled. If you don't want that to happen, then you need to hurry up. You can wait, but it doesn't mean my cousin can wait any longer. It took him so much effort to get his hands on his wife. If she doesn't want to marry him in the end, he will be very sad. Riley glanced at Louis and harumphed. Do you think he could get his hands on me if I didn't let him to? After chatting for a while, Maisie hung up the call. She was happy for Riley since it seemed to her that she had finally gotten over the thing that happened to Joe. Nolan came downstairs. And a smile appeared on his face when he saw Maisie was preparing dinner in the kitchen. He walked to her, hugged her from behind, and buried his head into her neck. Chapter 1023. Nolan took Maisie by surprise. She turned her head around and said, I'm cooking. He chuckled deeply and said, Yeah, I know. I can smell it from upstairs. Really? It seems like my cooking has improved a bit. Maisie spooned out a bit to taste the flavor before passing the spoon near his lips. Give it a try. Nolan leaned over and pressed his lips over hers. Then, he laughed. It's sweet. Maisie's face turned red with embarrassment as she pushed him away. You're so shameless. He let out a muffled chuckle as his chest vibrated. He turned her around and asked, You just learned that I'm shameless after knowing me for so long? He turned off the fire and lowered his head to kiss her. Today was another day Maisie fell for his charms again. As she responded to his passionate kisses. She complained in an intermittent whisper, "Sooner or later, I'm going to die in your hands." He chuckled lightly and whispered into her ear, "Don't worry. I'll make sure you'll live a long life with me." They continued with their intimate activity for a long while. After they were done, Nolan carried her to the table and kissed the top of her head. "Sit here. I'll set up the table." Soon, Nolan set up the table and brought a piece of meat to her mouth. "Come, open your mouth." Maisie was tickled pink by him and said, "What am I to you? Kid?" He put his hand on his forehead and lifted his eyebrow. "Well, you can be a kid if you want in front of your husband." Suddenly, his phone on the table rang. She glanced at it, and it was a call from Anthony. Nolan answered the call and talked to Anthony for a while. When he hung up the call, Maisie asked, "What's the matter?" Nolan looked at her and smiled. "His daughter has woken up." Maisie was stunned. His daughter had been in a coma for 11 years, and she had woken up. Maisie thought of something and hastily pulled her phone out. "I have to tell Riley about this." At Bassburg Airport, Riley and Lewis went straight to the nursing home as soon as they arrived at the airport. By the time they arrived at the nursing home, Nolan and Maisie were standing in the corridor waiting for them. She walked up to Maisie and asked pantingly, "Did she really awaken?" Maisie glanced toward the ward as her answer. Riley followed her gaze and looked into the ward. She saw that Naomi was sitting on her bed talking to her father. Naomi turned her head around, and she was stunned when she saw Riley standing outside of the ward. Then, she smiled at her and asked, "Is that Riley?" Anthony rose to his feet and said, "I'm sure you two have a lot to talk about, so I'll go out first." Naomi smiled and nodded. Anthony then came out of the ward. Riley lowered her head and pressed her lips tightly. She paced into the ward and said, "Naomi, why you're awake?" "Yeah." Naomi looked at her. "My dad has told me everything." "I'm sorry, Riley. It must have been very hard for you in the past few years while I was in a coma." Riley scratched her cheek and replied, "It's fine. It's all in the past. And I got over it long ago." She smiled upon saying that and added, "I'm really happy that you managed to wake up." Riley and Naomi chatted happily in the ward while Lewis stood by the door and watched them without saying anything. Naomi looked toward the door and asked with a smile, "Is that your boyfriend?" Riley was stunned. She turned her head around to look at Lewis. When she spun her head back to face Naomi, there were 2 blushes on her cheeks. "We're going to get married soon." Naomi laughed. "Congratulations, then." Riley touched her cheeks. They were burning hot and she felt embarrassed. After chatting for a while, Riley came out and let Naomi take her rest. She bade her goodbye and came out to the corridor. "Where is Z?" she asked after looking around. Chapter 1024. Lewis wrapped his arm around her shoulder and said, "They have already left." Then Riley blinked her eyes, and before she could finish her sentence, Lewis scooped her up from the floor and smiled at her. "Of course. We're going back to start preparing for our wedding." Riley hugged his neck and said, "I want a very romantic wedding." "And?" He chuckled. Riley thought for a while and answered, "And a fancy carriage too." Lewis nodded in assent. After that, Riley began to count her fingers and continued, "After we're married, you can't diss me, you gotta let me win when we're having a fight, and you must not flirt with other women." Lewis stopped and looked at the woman in his arms. "Since when did I flirt with other women?" Riley was stumped. She looked at him and said, "I mean after we get married." Then, she added, "People told me that a man will become a whole different person after getting married. What if you dislike me after? Become fat and ugly when I'm pregnant?" I need to. Lewis lowered his head and shut her mouth with a kiss. After a long while, they moved away from each other, and he said, "Don't worry. There's no way I would dislike my cute baby girl. Riley felt something was not right. What baby girl? Louis squinted meaningfully. And it was only then that Riley realized what he was talking about. She smacked him and said, "Who is your baby girl?" Louis chuckled and replied, "You, of course. I take care of you like my baby daughter." Riley then went closer and whispered into his ear. "Then should I call you Daddy instead?" Louis was rendered speechless. The weddings were due in a few days. The Hills, the Lucases, and the Bouchers were preparing for the weddings. Of course. The Goldmans were making their own preparations as well. 3 families would hold their weddings at the same time. It was a huge event that attracted a lot of attention. Riley was putting on her corset in the dressing room. She gasped and said, "Since when have I put on so much weight?" Maisie, who was putting on her makeup beside her, couldn't help herself but chuckle. "It seems like Louis has taken good care of you in the past few days." Ouch. Stop. Stop. Hold on for a second. Riley took a deep breath and said, "Okay. 1, 2, 3, go." She pulled her stomach in and finally put on her corset. She stood with her hands on her hips before the mirror and said, "Why must the fat grow around my waist? It would be good if the fat grew around my chest, making it into a C cup." Maisie chuckled. Riley looked outside and asked, "Where is Barbara?" While the stylist was making her hair, Maisie replied, "She arrived before us and finished her makeup a long time ago." Soon Maisie was done with her styling, so she stood up and looked at Riley, who had put on her wedding gown. The style of her wedding gown was different from that of Barbara. She was wearing a low-cut ball gown wedding dress with puffed sleeves and embroidered with pearls. There was a beaded veil draped over her head, and she wore a pair of pearl earrings that matched her playful and sweet demeanor. Riley grabbed the hem of her gown and said, "Why is this wedding gown so heavy?" After that, she looked at Maisie and asked, "Where is your wedding gown?" Maisie looked behind her and replied, "Over there." Riley turned her around and saw a black wedding gown on the marionette in the closet. The wedding was held at the seaside church with its surroundings lavishly decorated. The red carpet stretched from the statue square to the church, and there were 3 golden carriages parked at the entrance. There were plenty of luxury cars in the car park. And some reporters had arrived on the scene as well. When Riley came out of the dressing room, she bumped into Barbara and Christina. Looking at Riley, Christina laughed. "Time surely flies so fast. In the blink of an eye, you're going to get married." Riley laughed embarrassingly. Barbara looked into the dressing room and asked, "Is Z not done yet?" Chapter 1025. Riley replied, "I guess she's almost done. She's done her makeup already." Larissa came and said, "The wedding is about to start." "Where is Z?" "I'm here." Maisie came out of the dressing room in her wedding gown. The dark-colored wedding dress was exquisitely crafted and beautifully tailored, with a layer of gradient-colored tulle outside her gown that stretched to the ground. 3 grooms were waiting in front of the carriages. After a while, they saw their brides walking toward them. Nolan had put on a double-breasted black tuxedo with gold lines on the sleeves, echoing Maisie's gilded black veil. Nolan stretched his hand toward her. Maisie held his hand, and he grabbed her into his arms. He scooped her up from the ground, and as he carried her into the carriage, he whispered into her ear, "You're so pretty tonight, Z." Maisie chuckled lightly and replied, "You're very handsome as well." Nolan wrapped his arms around her waist and stroked her cheek through the veil. "This handsome man will be yours alone from today onward." The 3 carriages were moving forward slowly in a front-to-back arrangement, with a lively crowd of people standing on both sides. The carriage stopped outside the statue square. The 3 newlyweds came out of the carriages and stepped on the red carpet as they walked together toward the church. The staff fired the salute, and colorful rose petals fell from the sky. Maisie held Nolan's arm and stepped into the church, followed by Barbara and Helios and Louis and Riley. The large and sacred church had multicolored windows and murals all around. The families of the three couples and the guests at the ceremony all rose to clap and greet them. The pastor stood on the platform, looking at the three couples. His face filled with a kind smile as he recited the benediction. Soon, it was time for them to exchange vows. The pastor looked at them and asked, "Gentlemen, will you take the beautiful lady beside you as your wife and never leave her side regardless of any reasons, be it poverty or sickness?" The three grooms said, "Yes, I do." The pastor then continued, "Ladies, will you marry the man beside you? Stay with him through thick and thin, and never leave his side forever?" The three brides said, "Yes, I do." The pastor closed the book and raised his hand. "Please exchange your rings." Nolan pulled out the ring that he had prepared and slowly put it on Maisie's ring finger. He lifted her hand and kissed her fingertip. "You'll be mine for the rest of your life, Z." Maisie also helped him to put on his ring. "Yeah. We're tied together for the rest of our life. It's too late for you to regret it now." He chuckled and said, "I won't regret it." Nolan flipped open her veil, lowered his head, and kissed her. The guests on the scene applauded upon witnessing their love. Daisy, Waylon, and Colton were smiling from ear to ear after witnessing their parents' love. Titus wrapped his arm around Waylon's shoulder. He was touched by the sight as well since his son and daughter-in-law finally tied the knot after going through so many hardships. After the wedding in the church, it was time for the banquet, which was held in the hotel ballroom. The airfare and accommodation for the guests were all covered, and they had booked nearly the entire hotel. The brides and the grooms had changed into a new set of clothes as they greeted their guests in the ballroom. Louis looked at Robin and Blake walking toward him with a glass of wine in their hands. He offered them a smile and said, "You guys really are punctual." Robin offered him a toast and said, "You're the groom tonight." "Of course, we need to be punctual." Blake looked around and chimed in, "I didn't expect there to be so many beauties tonight." Louis cleared his throat and said, "You guys enjoy the sight yourself. Don't drag me along with you. If that tigress of mine gets angry, I'll be in big trouble." "Who are you calling a tigress?" Riley appeared out of nowhere and looked at him in confusion. Chapter 1026. Louis looked at her. "You've misheard. I didn't say anything just now." Bobbin and Blake were rendered speechless. Riley frowned. "Really?" Louis responded with a nod, then picked up a piece of cake and delivered it into her mouth. "Does it taste delicious?" "It's not bad." Riley nodded, forgot what she wanted to ask, turned around, and started eating the cake. Louis looked at the dumbstruck Robin and Blake and gave off a faint smile. Robin and Blake gave him a thumbs up. "Damn, bro. You're totally in control." On the other hand, because Barbara was pregnant, she could only accept the toasts and blessings from everyone with warm water instead of wine. Nina and Helios' manager, Morgan, came up to them and proposed a toast, while entertainers and directors who were close to Helios came along too. Morgan laughed when he saw Daisy and Waylon. "Aren't these two our young celebrities from back then?" Daisy remembered him. She was wearing a beautiful princess dress and nodded at him. "Hi there, Uncle Morgan." Morgan's heart melted, and he could not stop laughing. "Oh my, Daisy. You're so polite. You used to be such a tiny little girl, but you've grown up a little, huh?" Helios turned his head and looked at Daisy, who was standing beside him, rubbed her head with a grin, and said to Morgan, "Are you thinking about recruiting Daisy again? At least wait until she's 18 years old before you reach your dirty hands out for her. Even Zester has had their eyes fixed on her." "Zester Media Corporation?" Morgan pouted. "I won't let Zester snatch such a great talent away from me." Daisy blinked. "Is Zester a company too?" Morgan laughed. It's in the same industry as Royal Crown Entertainment, but it's not as good as we are. So remember to consider returning to Royal Crown when you turn 18. Barbara saw that Morgan was so eager to recruit Daisy, and could not help but tease Helios. Look, Z's baby girl is even more famous than you are now. How can I compare myself with this little girl? Helios wrapped his arms around her waist and smiled helplessly. His gaze landed on her slightly bulged abdomen upon saying that. I hope our baby is going to be a little girl too. Barbara looked at him. Do you prefer a baby girl? He laughed. I'm fine with either, but girls are generally more obedient. Barbara stroked her belly and laughed. I can feel the baby kicking me gently. It's definitely not an obedient one. Helios narrowed his eyes slightly. Then it seems like it'll be a naughty boy. I'll teach him a lesson on your behalf when he comes out. Barbara giggled. Maisie and Nolan came over. There will be a surprise at the rooftop garden later on too. Barbara was surprised. A surprise? Maisie nodded. This is a barbecue party organized only for our acquaintances, so we'll have to party for 3 nights straight no matter what. Mom. There will be a barbecue tonight? Daisy blinked. Nolan rubbed her head. Are you a piglet? Why are you always so gleeful whenever there's something to eat? Daisy pouted while everyone else laughed. At 10 p.m., everyone took the elevator to the Sky Garden. The barbecue party on the roof was ready, and the lights in the garden were all perfectly integrated into the lights beaming and shimmering all around the city. Riley saw something and pointed. The advertisement. The contents of the LED advertising boards located on several skyscrapers around them were changed into their blessings, and they had preserved the boards that were located in the best positions in downtown Bassburg. Everyone could see the blessings clearly. At the barbecue party, everyone was eating while chatting and having fun with each other. Colton and Riley were sitting in front of the piano and playing for the crowd while Lewis was grilling skewers with Daisy and Waylon. Chapter 1027. Robin helped at the grilling station while Blake was bartending for the guests. Maisie sat on the bench and stared into the night scene in the distance, holding a glass of red wine in her hand. Nolan found her after entertaining the guests. He walked toward her and sat down right next to her. Maisie leaned on his shoulder and gave off a slightly drunken smile. Sherry and Dad would be very happy too if they were both here, wouldn't they? Nolan hugged her by her shoulders, lowered his head, and kissed the top of her head. Yeah. They definitely would. Nolan Goldman, LM very happy. She held his hand and interlocked both their fingers. I don't regret meeting you. Nolan looked down at the person in his arms, who had blushing cheeks, and chuckled. Z, you're drunk. She sat up and frowned. Since when am I drunk? I'm not. With a soft giggle, he took her into his arms again. Okay, you're not drunk. Maisie looked up at him and brushed her finger over the bridge of his handsome nose and thin lips. Nobody knew if the night sky was too charming or the wine was too intoxicating. But Maisie actually leaned forward to kiss him. Nolan held the back of her head, and his lips were tightly pressed against hers. Both of them only separated from each other when they were both out of breath. I'd lose control if you were to continue to stare at me with those eyes. Nolan pinched her chin and stared straight at her. Maisie's eyes turned into 2 curved lines, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled herself closer to his ear. I want to go back to our room already. Nolan raised his eyebrows. What are we going to do when we get back to our room? Her gaze looked a little hazy. Whatever you want. Nolan picked her up in a Princess Carrie, and Lewis asked when he saw the two of them leave the party. What happened to Z? Nolan looked down at her. She's drunk. The moment Nolan carried her back to the guest room and put her down on the big soft bed, Maisie undid his tie, pulled it off him, and rolled over to trap him under her crotch. The next day, when Maisie woke up, She did not know how intense the hangover was. The only thing she felt was a splitting headache. Nolan opened the curtains, and a beam of sunlight shone on the bed. She narrowed her eyes slightly, raised her hand to block the beam, and wanted to speak. But her throat was extremely dry. He pulled the window screen down and noticed a slight movement behind him, so he turned around and glanced at Maisie. "You've woken up." Maisie responded softly, "I'm thirsty." Nolan poured her a glass of water, picked her up, and smirked at her. "That's the consequence of overdrinking." Maisie took the glass from him and drank all the water in it. She was almost fully awakened after that. She then thought of something and looked up at Nolan. "How did I get back here last night?" Nolan put the empty glass on the bedside table and squinted slightly. "You actually don't remember a thing?" Maisie tried her best to recall what had happened last night, and some fragmentary memories returned to her. She then saw the marks on Nolan's neck and chest, and her cheeks flushed instantly. "I actually forced Nolan into sleeping with me." Nolan pinched her chin with his fingertips and leaned over to approach her. "You climbed all over me several times last night." Maisie flicked his hand away and quickly got back under the blanket. "I must have drunk too much." Nolan smiled, lifted the blanket, got right above her, and trapped her under his chest, leaving her with nowhere to escape. "You're really a scumbag, Z. You've done everything you did to me last night, and you're now refusing to admit it." She was ashamed. "I didn't." She felt extremely guilty when she said that. Nolan's smile intensified. "Oh really? Look at the mess that you've left on my body. Can you tell me which of them didn't come from you?" "Nolan, stop it." She buried her face into the pillow. "I'm 29 this year, and I'm about to turn 30 this year. Will I be considered to be a lustful woman from today onward? But it's obviously the alcohol's fault." Chapter 1028. Nolan turned her over, rubbed her lips with his fingertips seductively, and let off a smirk. "I've become your man from last night onward, so I'll be more than happy if you can continue to spoil me like how you did last night." Maisie covered her face. "You're still laughing at me, you bastard." Nolan picked her up from the bed, and Maisie wrapped her arms around his neck subconsciously. "What do you think you're doing?" "Bath." Maisie tried to push him away from her twice. "Why are you bringing me alone when you want to take a bath?" He felt extremely helpless. "You threw up on me last night, and I had to clean up for you all night, so I smell like crap now." Maisie was stunned and stared at him suspiciously. "Didn't you say?" Nolan took her to the bathroom and turned on the tap, and water started to gush into the bathtub. "You caressed me and seduced me last night, but you vomited on me before we even got to the main show, and the rest was history." "That's how I spent the whole night last night." Maisie felt embarrassed. "It turns out that it didn't go as I thought. I wanted to get it on with him, but I failed." Nolan wrapped her in his arms. "So, how do you plan to compensate me?" Maisie blinked, stood on tiptoe, and kissed his cheek. But she then broke free from his arms and went to wash up. Nolan chuckled. At 9 a.m., they went to the restaurant for breakfast. Daisy, Waylon, and Colton had already woken up long ago and were sitting next to their grandfather, eating breakfast. "Good morning, Mom." Daisy nibbled away on her lobster as her eyes were squinted into crescents because of the grin. Waylon fetched a bowl of oatmeal for Maisie. "You drank too much last night and probably won't have an appetite for anything this morning. You should have some oatmeal." Looking at Waylon, her sensible son, Maisie could not help but feel warm deep down. "Thank you, Waylon." Nolan pulled the chair out for her. Maisie picked up a spoon and ate the oatmeal after sitting down. Nicholas fetched Daisy more food and took a glance at Nolan. "Now that the wedding is over, isn't it time for you to leave the company's business behind for a while?" Maisie stared at Nolan suspiciously. Nolan smiled. "I'm planning to go away on a long vacation." Maisie leaned over to him. "You're doing fine. Why would you need a long vacation? So that I can accompany you. Nolan fetched some snacks and placed them on her plate. Maisie still had not returned to her senses. Nicholas explained with a smile, Nolan used to be so busy and didn't have the time to do so. And he doesn't feel good about letting you travel back and forth between countries by yourself. Thus, he said he would hand everything over to Quincy after the wedding ceremony and dealing with all the company's current affairs. Then he would have the time to accompany you. Maisie was dumbfounded. She had to travel back and forth between the two countries because she had to deal with the de Armas affairs. And he did live up to his words when he had said that he would accompany her throughout the whole journey. She looked at Nolan, feeling extremely touched again. After breakfast, Maisie, Nolan, and the children sent Nicholas to the hotel entrance. Hans had already parked the car in front of the hotel, so Nicholas got into the car and waved to the children. The three children promised their Aunt Riley to go to the movies with her today, so they ran directly to Riley and their uncle, Louis. Maisie took Nolan's arm. Then shall we go home? Nolan looked down at her. Don't you want to go to the movies with them? We can watch a movie at home too. Maisie glanced at him, approached him, and added, the most important element is the time we get to spend together. At the Blue Bay Villa. Maisie and Nolan were sitting in front of the projection screen, watching a blockbuster romantic movie. When the intimate scene came up, Maisie, who was eating a fruit salad, took a glance at Nolan. Nolan's expression did not change. He looked very calm, even when the steamiest scene was up. Thus, it was a little embarrassing for her and only her. She turned her head and interrupted the ambience. How about we watch a horror movie? Nolan propped his hand against the side of his forehead and looked at her. Is this movie that bad? Chapter 1029. This movie. Maisie was about to open her mouth when an indescribable voice sounded all of a sudden, and her cheeks flushed in an instant. Oh, my God. Just what movie have I chosen to put on? I'll replace it. She put down the fruit salad and was about to get up. But Nolan pulled her back into his arms, so she sat back down. Nolan stared at her face, which looked as red as a ripe apple, and could not help but burst into laughter. Were you serious when you invited me to watch this movie with you? I'm dead serious. Maisie felt that her response to the question sounded a little inappropriate and added, I only plan to watch a movie with you. It's just the two of us now. Nolan approached her cheek with his lips as his palm rested on her waist. Don't you want to do something else? However, before Maisie could say a thing, he had already sealed her lips with his. And she, who was already thirsty and slightly lustful, felt like a traveler who had just found a water source to quench her thirst after being lost in the desert for days. Nolan's lips stopped on her neck, and he chuckled softly. I want you to act out like last night. I was too drunk to remember anything from last night. Maisie approached him, caressed Nolan's Adam's apple with her fingers, and then moved slowly downward until she arrived at his abdomen. Nolan pushed against her shoulders abruptly and picked her up. As someone who had always been very reserved and restrained, Nolan had lost his rationality and reasoning at that moment. Maisie's gaze looked chalky as if a layer of fog had covered it as she looked up at him with her teary eyes. Are you really going to leave your company behind and accompany me? Chapter 1030. Nolan pressed her against his chest and kissed her lips. Work will never be as important as you are. Maisie hugged him tightly as she buried her cheeks into his chest and teared up. I'll get spoiled if you continue to treat me this well. Getting used to all these will only give me an advantage. He chuckled softly in her ear, wiped her tears with his thumb, and hugged her tightly. I plan to pamper you to the extent of spoiling you so that I'll be the only person in this world who can add up to your way of life after this. Maisie did not know when the movie ended at all. The only thing she felt was the impact that he brought upon her. After a few more rounds, they cuddled together next to each other's sweaty bodies, and he was reluctant to withdraw himself from her warm embrace. Maisie stared at the blue roses that were blooming in the courtyard. They looked delicate and warm, just like the love that he had been showing her. I was lucky to have met you that night 10 years ago. If I were to be given the chance to choose again, I'd still choose to do so, and not regret it. Nolan lowered his gaze and looked at the woman in his arms. And a chuckle burst out from the bottom of his throat. You not regretting anything is enough for me. In a blink of an eye, the children's vacation had come to an end, and Waylon had to return to Stosslo again. Nolan and Maisie sent Waylon to the airport. And Hans carried his luggage for him after getting out of the car. Maisie walked up to Waylon and tidied his collar for him. Your father and I will travel to Stosslo and pay you a visit soon. Waylon nodded. Okay, then I shall take my leave first. Mom. Maisie hugged him and rubbed his head. Go then. Remember to take good care of yourself when you get there. Waylon and Hans walked into the security checkpoint. Maisie watched as they entered the checkpoint and then leaned on Nolan's shoulder. I'm very worried that Waylon has been living a harsh life in Stosslo. Nolan wrapped his arms around her shoulders. You're underestimating our son. He was the one who chose to follow my grandfather to Stosslo voluntarily. He's more resilient than I am. Maisie looked up at him. Will he be like Grandpa when he grows up? Waylon, my little angel, what would I do if he were to become someone ruthless and cold? Nolan chuckled and stroked her hair gently. How can we compare our era to that of my grandfather's? Besides, Waylon grew up by your side when he was still a child. He's a sensible kid who understands his responsibility, so how will he grow into a ruthless man? She smacked his hand away. Who knows? Waylon has already inherited the Goldman's infamous poker face. Nolan hugged her tightly in his arms and laughed. The Goldmans are all amorous people. But look at me, don't I look just like your pet when I'm around you? He then pinched her cheek. There's always a rock to every scissor. I should have stayed away from you when I knew that God had sent you to conquer me. Maisie snorted softly. It's too late for a reflection now. You're already my possession. Sol's branch had officially opened for business. At the opening ceremony, representatives of many companies in the industry sent flowers to congratulate Sol Jewelry, and among them was Taylor Jewelry. Madame Nara also made it there in person, and Maisie came to welcome her in person. Madame Nara and Maisie sat in the reception lounge. To see that Sol is expanding continuously. I'm really happy for you. Maisie poured her a cup of tea. You have such high expectations for me, I can't really let you down, can one? Madame Nara laughed. During the conversation, Madame Nara also talked about Tristan. The affairs surrounding the Knowles had already come to an end. Rick had inherited the Knowles, and Tristan had started a jewelry business in Yarramore, too. Maisie looked at Madame Nara. Mr. Knowles is doing well now, isn't he? Madame Nara held up the teacup, took a sip of tea, and nodded. Yeah, he's not as idle as he was before this anymore.